So let's talk through 10 of the strongest armies in Warhammer 40k right now in terms of win rates and what makes them so powerful on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking strong armies in game, where in this video I thought it could be interesting to take a look at the top end of the meta. Now a few weeks of tournaments have happened since the last balance updates. For this one I'm going to be focusing on armies that have been doing well, and as ever in Warhammer 40k there's a few different ways to assess army strength. The one I mainly like to go by is big tournament win percentage, a nice rough and ready metric for overall army power for the average player attempting to do well with a good list. I think it's probably the most helpful metric to the most players out there, so I usually tend to focus on that one first. For this one as well though, I thought we'd take a look at the percentage of people playing the army at grand tournaments, which certainly feels like it can offer some clues as to whether people are excited to put their army on the tabletop or not. That does have to be taken in context of faction popularity though, and also for a rough and ready look at the top of the meta. The numbers of armies that have actually won tournaments show which armies can compete at the highest level, and for this one I'll be counting 5-0 undefeated runs in with tournament wins as well, as going in with that kind of record at a really big tournament is kind of equivalent to winning a much smaller tournament. There's plenty of great places that track Warhammer 40k data, which I'll leave them links down in the video description, and most of them have been useful in making the videos. There's Meta Monday, StatCheck 40k, Den of Fools, Goonhammer and Best Coast pairings for tournament winning lists, and most of these have at least a couple of weeks of data posted now. I'll leave them linked down in the video description if you're interested to check them out. And broadly at the moment I would say that besides a few exceptions, 40k game balance really isn't too bad compared with how it's been in the past. Hopefully I'll follow up to talk about the bottom end of the meta in another video, but it maybe feels like there's only a couple of problem armies at the top that really seem to be doing clearly better than the rest. Lots and lots of armies out there are winning the biggest tournaments around when using a strong list played well. Though obviously there's always room for improvement, both for faction versus faction balance and making more builds viable within each army. As usual, just to underline that, I'd certainly say that player skill is more important than army choice in 40k right now. Lots of armies are clustered around the sort of 50% midpoint. Being in the top 10 strongest doesn't mean that the army is necessarily always overpowered, and for the absolute top levels of play it's maybe more important to look at things like event wins versus win rates, which can be skewed for a fair few different reasons, and sometimes armies often tend to have better win rates than they necessarily do with top event performance, Knights and Custodians often being good examples of those. In terms of stats though, I'd still probably say that win rate's probably the most important metric to most players out there, just because it reflects a more average experience, and the majority of 40k players don't tend to be scrapping for the absolute top spots at grand tournaments. Getting into it properly though, and starting out, there's a few honourable mentions for the mid-tier on win rates, and here I'd say are armies that are pretty strong armies in their own right, but maybe not necessarily vying for best in game at the moment, though some certainly seem to be doing better at sort of top level tournament performance than others. Here we have the Space Wolves, Leaguers of Votann, Tyranids, Sisters of Battle, Adeptus Mechanicus, Chaos Marines, Death Guard and Astra Militarum, all on anywhere between 48 and 50% wins. A fair few of them aren't really too surprising, and they're armies that have been around this sort of level for a long time. I would say that a few of these do have very low player numbers. Space Wolves, Admech and Sisters just don't really have all that much data for them, and maybe implies that people aren't super enthusiastic to play their factions. I feel like Space Wolves have their numbers repressed a bit because people are waiting to jump on board with them with their new army refresh, and plenty of people haven't really been collecting new big armies of them recently as a result. Despite being okay in the win rates, still doesn't feel like Sisters are in a great place after their nerfs and then only a few token adjustments last time around. It certainly doesn't seem to have made too many people more enthusiastic to play the faction in tournaments, and perhaps somewhat similar for Admech. There were a couple of these armies I wanted to focus on just a little bit, just because they seem to be doing quite so well at actually winning tournaments, and that's the Astra Militarum and the Space Marines. The Guard are on a 48% win rate, so out of the top 10 on that perspective, and a little bit dropped compared with around about 50% post-Codex release. They're the 6th most played army, but they do seem to be doing rather well on the actual event win numbers, taking either 7 tournament trophies or undefeated runs, and that puts them solidly towards the top end of 40k on that metric, being joint third with a couple of other factions. For their last balance changes, it was largely nerfs, and they mainly fell on the Tempestus Scions and the Bridgehead Strike detachment, which was still looking like the absolute dominant way to play Guard at grand tournaments, with most people choosing to take that, and getting some seriously hefty win rates of like 60% or more. Definitely felt like it was in line for bad things to happen to it, but both nerfing the Scion datasheets and the detachment itself felt maybe a little bit on the brutal side. Otherwise, field ordnance and heavy weapons went up, and combat engineers got a bit weaker with their special rule. After the balance updates, it's now Combined Arms Regiment and Hammer of the Emperor, both being played to good numbers in tournaments, and both of those also seem to be having some good success. In general, tending to go at least fairly heavy on tanks for the damage dealers, often Rogel Dawn tank commanders backed up by a few Lehman Russes for fire support, regular battle tanks or exterminators often, and then perhaps some other fire support buffs like Scout Sentinels or Hellhounds. For other staple units at the moment, Creed plus Acadian Command Squad with Acadian Shock Troops is quite a common include. That's some sticky objectives, and then a whole bunch of efficient orders plus some free stratagems thrown in. Kasrkin and Tauroxes are a staple, fast moving and powerful punchy special weapons, but nice with their orders after they disembark. Gaunt's Ghosts can do some secondary objectives, and Kazachan Jungle Fighters and Scout Sentinels are nice to scrap for the midboard. Overall seems like the numbers have them more as an army that the average player finds kind of mid-tier, but top players around seem to be able to get them right to the very top. Perhaps at least a few intelligent decisions needing to be made by making sure the tanks are advancing forward and dealing damage, and expending your infantry when needed for screening and scoring. I guess maybe you could criticise that they do tend to be a little bit overly tank dependent in terms of damage output, without so much emphasis on infantry combos or artillery strikes, which suits a lot of people fine, but it seems like very few people are managing to make guard work well with a very heavy infantry focus at the moment. In any case, doing solidly well, a kind of mid-tier win rates, but doing rather well at the tops of tournaments. Kind of in a similar sort of boat are the Space Marines as well. For big tournament win rates, they're around about 47% at the moment, minus 3% down from the pre-update 50% that they had. They're the second most popular army that people are choosing to take at grand tournaments, just pipped out there by the Custodes it seems. And similar to the Guard, they had either 7 top tournament placings or undefeated runs, so joint with them. They certainly do feel a little bit less standout after the balance updates though. They got a lot of small points nerfs to current meta units, things like Vindicators, Ballistas, Dreadnoughts, Marnius Calgar, the Company Heroes, and a few more. The Centurions and Uriel Ventress combo was nerfed for Vanguard, but it did have a couple of things swing the other way, such as 80-point Blade Guard, and Centurions and Fire Discipline dropping in cost a little. In competitive play, quite a lot of detachments get used. The Gladius is still the single most common, with Vanguard, Ironstorm and Firestorm tending to place after that, but people do use some other detachments as well, such as some people experimenting with Librarius or Stormlance. At the moment, competitive Space Marines are basically Ultramarines with Guilliman, which definitely isn't the ideal way to have the faction balanced. His potential double Oath of moments and free stratagems to happen both in yours and the opponent's turn are enormous game-changing boosts, and is often accompanied by Marnius Calgar with the Company Heroes, still seeming to be efficient enough even at their higher points cost. Guilliman and the big +1 to wound oath is often commanding a hefty firebase, with lots of people still using Vindicators and Ballistas Dreadnoughts, maybe with some ignored cover from a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike. And then Space Marines have a large amount of powerful special rule units, often taken in singles. Intercessors, Scouts, Infiltrators, the Combi Lieutenant, Incursors and Jump Intercessors are all quite interesting for skirmishing and objectives, each in their own way. Then add that to a few units that might be unusually good in one detachment, say like a Tech Marine for Ironstorm, or Inceptors for Vanguard or similar. Overall, at the moment, like Guard, they seem to have a sort of middling win rate, but doing quite well at the very tops of events. That really doesn't seem to be too surprising. It does seem to be Ultramarines and everyone else, and I feel like the everyone else will be dragging the faction down with lower win rates, unfortunately, where Ultramarines will be placing ahead. It did seem like an odd balance decision where Space Marines were sort of overly dependent on Guilliman, not to increase the cost of Guilliman, but instead to have the nerfs fall on other units, as that just seems to hurt a bunch of chapters that weren't really problematic in any way. In any case, with those two honourable mentions aside, let's get into the top 10 based on win rate. And first up we have the Chaos Knights. Tournament wins around 51%, so that's around plus 3% from prior to the update. A sort of a middling played faction at tournaments, 14th out of 27, and a bit behind the Imperial Knights. So far they've just taken a couple of event wins, so not absent from the top tables, but not dominant. The balance changes for the Knights didn't really change all that much, small decreases for the Titanic Knight variants, though as usual it doesn't really seem to have moved the needle on them whatsoever. For their top competitive list, the changes to Demons might have made more impact if anything. When they take to the field, it's with their Traitorous Lance, it makes their faction rule far more impactful, and then there's things like the War Dog Sustained Hits one, Diabolic Bulwark, the ability to walk through walls when needed, which is really nice for War Dogs, plus some usable enhancements. Having a quick look at their competitive list, and it does seem to be essentially all War Dog spam pretty much. The cookie cutter build for far too long now has been the War Dog Carnivore and War Dog Brigands, and just take a massive amount of those, maybe with a War Dog Stalker to lead, and then usually supported by a few Chaos Demons, maybe Nurglings, Plague Bearers, or Beasts of Nurgle seeming to be some of the more popular ones. Generally the Titanic Knights can be used, but maybe one if you're feeling daring, and a whole load of lists seem to just be playing War Dogs as ever. Overall, doesn't really feel like too much has changed for them. They move fast, hit hard with some big scary weapon profiles. War Dogs are nice enough for scoring objectives and have a fair bit of weight on points, and have the general Knight things of tending to be a bit of a stat check army as to whether or not you can kill them and manage them, so often tend to be a bit more mid at big grand tournaments and things, and do a fair bit better at smaller tournaments or more casually. Their main faction issue still feels like the big knights being really weak. Fingers crossed the Codex can do at least something to make them better. Next up, and also on around 51%, we've got the Adeptus Custodes. They actually seem to have dropped down a little bit since pre-update, if anything from around 52%. They're still clearly remaining a solid faction, and it appears that they're the single most popular army to play at tournaments right now out of the 27 factions, very slightly ahead of Space Marines. Between them, they've had 4 big tournament wins or 5-0 undefeated runs, so say compared with Space Marines not quite winning as much at the very top level as might often be the case for Custodes. And interestingly, out of the detachments chosen, it feels like for actual top level performance, there maybe feels like there's a few more event performances coming in from the people playing Shield Host and the Solar Spearhead, at least compared with Lines of the Emperor where the vast majority are playing. For their balance update, they had both points and rules changes. Wardens and the Blade Champion went up in cost, Custodian Guard and Captains went down a bit, but there were some focal nerfs to Solar Spearhead Dreads and one enhancement, and they did get that Lines of the Emperor detachment added, which has become the single most played detachment for them. It does seem that lots of people are very keen to check that out with its massive damage buffs if the Custodes units are fighting in isolation, plus a bunch of usable stratagems for skirmishing in the mid-board, and some interesting enhancements for Shield Captains, a lot of which get play. It seems that between the 3 detachments now, really quite a lot of Custodes units are actually getting a fair bit of time on the tabletop. Wardens and Blade Champions are still a strong staple, both really tough and pretty dangerous. The Dreadnoughts can still work in Solar Spearhead, it's not gone away. Custodian Guard are still often paired with Inquisitor Draxus, and they're a bit cheaper than they used to be. Virtus Praetors and Venetari are both usable, and in the Lines detachments, the Alvarez Terminators and Jetbike and Terminator Captains both seem to be doing good work. They'd certainly not been played quite so much in other detachments prior to the update and the points cut. As ever, it maybe seems like they're not getting quite as many event wins as per the amount of people playing them. So as usual, maybe tending to be a slightly more simplistic playing army, marching up to the mid-board and seeing if the opponent can bash their way through a whole bunch of 4+ invulnerable saves, at least compared with some factions out there, though obviously even these guys and the Knights have got plenty of scope for player skill. Overall, they seem to be in a pretty okay place, fairly balanced win rates and plenty of use for a lot of the units in their army. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain, who have one option to get a table full of 40k terrain with an unusual design with its focus based on being able to store flat, transport really easily, and not need any hobby work to get it up and running. The idea behind their stuff is you basically have a grid worth of 12 tiles, each one unfolds and up pops a cardboard building, so you can basically have a grid system with an entire battlefield worth of terrain that can all fit in the same sort of box as a normal board game. It means it's very easy to store if space is limited, easy to transport if you're going round to someone else's house to play, and as is usually the case, from terrain from third-party manufacturers does cost a lot less than Games Workshop's offerings. There's 3 different designs for the pieces, each going down some different battlefield themes. I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through a few of the pros and cons and some of the specific sets that they have. In any case, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring this one, and you can find them linked down in the video description if you want to give their stuff a look over. Moving onwards with Scary Armies of Warhammer 40k, and in 8th place we have the Grey Knights. Again, they're also on around about 51%, just very slightly up from their pre-update 50-ish. They're a lesser played faction at tournaments, at 18th out of 27 armies, that maybe feels around about where they tend to have their resting point normally, and have had some okay top tournament performance, 3 victories or 5-0 undefeated runs. Maybe not too surprising, they're kind of similar to where they were. They didn't really get too much change in the balance update, a small interceptor points decrease, and then a restriction that you can't use their rerolls for the Warpbane Task Force out of line of sight, so hitting the Purgation squads and occasionally certain melees. For the detachments used, it's typically the Warpbane Task Force at the moment, the one with big damage rerolls for units within your zone of control, particularly relevant for Dread Knight shooting. Though a really helpful big damage buff for any unit that can trigger it, and Purifiers are an extra focal unit given that they can provide those rerolls and can be kind of scarier with some of the stratagem support. Dread Knights tend to be in just about every list in good numbers, often 3 or more, and they're the main unit that can deal with enemy heavies, so it's kind of understandable there. Terminators with Caldor Drago are a pretty reasonable one to get some melee exactly where needed, and then most of the power armoured forces are alright. Strike Marines warping around for sticky objectives, some Purifiers for the rerolls, and Interceptors are quite solid, particularly with a small points decrease. Purgation squads with Psy Cannons not tending to crop up quite so much though. Overall doesn't really feel like they're in the worst place in the world, though perhaps not ideal that they don't have absolutely great balance between their 2 detachments, and as a faction maybe need some big decisions with how you play them, particularly with pulling units from the board and deciding to balance staying safe or dealing damage versus scoring. Overall though, they're doing fairly well, a good overall win percentage, some performance at the top end of tournaments despite having a smallish player pool. Also around here we've got the Deathwatch. Looks like they've dropped down very slightly to 51% wins from their previous 53. As is usually the case for them, they're one of the very least played armies in tournaments, 25th out of 27. Though I suspect that's more reflective of people probably a bit apprehensive to get into the faction with what Games Workshop's been doing with messing around with them, and briefly consigning them to be inside the badly supported Agents in the Imperium Codex, which maybe doesn't fill people with loads of confidence collecting and playing the army. They've just had the one tournament win, which in itself is respectable enough given that they have very low player numbers. The balance change was again kind of smallish for them. Their Terminator squads went up 10 points to 190, though still seem a good unit. Some of the Space Marine fire support choices were nerfed, but did get some cheaper Devastator Centurions if you wanted to use them. Deathwatch armies tend to use their Blackspear detachment. That gives you the mission tactics for multiple rounds worth of boosted damage or sniping. The special issue ammo stratagems, which are pretty powerful on their kill teams. The Teleportarium to warp around the board, and some good enhancements like the damage dealing Tome of Ectoclades or the big hitting Thief of Secrets. For stronger units, Games Workshop seem to have got their kill teams in a fairly good spot where most of them are pretty usable. The Veterans and Terminators are both good, the Gravis Indomitor is a nice one, and the Talon Strike one I think is interesting enough, often headed up by things like the Watchmaster, Gravis Captain, or Judas, maybe taking the Thief of Secrets on one of those to give you a seriously scary melee character. Space Marines again have loads of support units, things like Infiltrators, maybe some Storm Speeders for fire support buffs, perhaps a Combi Lieutenant could all be nice enough, and at 330 points for 6 of them, the Devastator Centurions are interesting enough here as well, being able to warp around the board with the Teleportarium. That would be consuming the choice for other units wanting to use it. In general, they tend to play with some really big chunky units that can deal a whole ton of damage, but maybe aren't particularly standout tough for the cost, and you could lose some important things for little reward if they don't manage to get into the enemy's good targets or get hit first or something. It's certainly still looking like in the right hands they're a force to be reckoned with though. Next up, and on 52% wins, we've got the Genestealer Cults, placing in 6th on this list. They seem to have risen very slightly since the last balance update, plus 2% from their pre-update 50. For their play rate at grand tournaments, they're around the 19th most popular army out of the 27, which actually isn't too bad for them. They're often an army that seems to be vying for the bottom spot in terms of player rate, just because they're a relatively niche collected faction. So far, it doesn't look like they've had any 5-0 undefeated runs or event wins, though I suspect it's only a matter of time really. They do have a slightly lower sample size than some of the rest on this list. Again, for the balance changes, it was kind of minimal. It had a nerf to big blocks of Neophytes, going up 15 points, though kind of as I was suspecting really, it hasn't really hurt them too much. The Host of Ascension still seems to be doing very well with them, and still uses big blocks of Neophytes with character attachments for damage from reserves. And the other two detachments played most in competitive seems to be the melee-focused Biosanctic Brood Surge, with its focus on Aberrants, Pure Strains, and the Biophagus, and the final day one allied with the Tyranids, typically running a whole bunch of the Tyranid Lone Operatives, annoying units to remove that can still provide the big buffs to the units nearby. Aside from detachment-specific stuff, the Achilles Ridge Runners are almost always a staple, handing out a bit of extra AP is pretty great, and kind of hard to go too far wrong with some small Acolyte units of either variety. Cheap expendable threats that can be used to farm command points or deal some punchy damage in their two different ways. I would certainly rate them as one of the harder armies to play in Warhammer 40k. Certainly lots of potential for power, but also big decisions to be made, and units having to punch up with the Alpha Strike quite a lot, and do feel like the sort of army where an expert player with them does far better than someone just taking up the faction. In 5th place, it seems that we have the Deathless Necrons, big tournament win rates of 52%, which seems to be pretty well the same as it was prior to the balance update. They're a popular army to be played at tournaments, the 7th most played at big events, which isn't bad, but I'd say probably not super standout for them. They are a very popular army, though they are one of the armies that's been getting more top event victories, 6 wins or 5-0 undefeated runs, and that's the 6th most there, so certainly an army with some good top table performance. Maybe not too surprising that nothing changed crazily for them. The only real balance change that they had was a small increase to Doomsday Arcs of plus 10 points. That did feel relevant given that loads of armies play them and still do, but at very worst it was only ever going to be a 30-point tax on an army even if you were running 3. I'm not sure if it's just the Doomsday Arc change, but it looks like things are now a bit more balanced in terms of play between people using the Awakened Dynasty versus the Starshatter Arsenal. The Awakened being the one with the big character combos, a +1 to hit for character-led units and some really powerful stratagems, and the Starshatter Arsenal being the Grotmas one where you get extra damage against objectives and big boosts for things like the Doomsday Arcs and the Silent King. maybe a Hexmark Destroyer or two to bear some helpful enhancements as well. Otherwise, for strong Necron units, Imitate the Stormlord's often helpful for his extra command points. There's plenty of good options for cheapish skirmish units, Flayed Ones, Lone Locust Destroyers, Ophidians burrowing on and off the board, and the Death Marks. Reanimators are pretty handy in any detachment that's got a reactive reanimate stratagem, and both the Star Shatter and the Awakened Dynasty can do that, so they're pretty good in both of those. The Catalan can bring loads of massive power with the Nightbringer and Void Dragon in particular. Character combos often tend to be the order of the day in Awakens, and Hypercrypt's likely to find some room for a Monolith or other super heavy. Overall, Necrons seem to be in a fairly solid place. There's still some overshadowed datasheets, maybe things like the Triarch Praetorians could do with a bit of love. There are a few other things that just feel like they don't have too much point compared with other options. I feel like it might be a little bit nicer to see a bit more emphasis on the core troops things like warriors or immortals with leaders attached. It's not that they can't work in some detachments, but just feels like they're often passed over. Overall, though, definitely an interesting and powerful faction with a bunch of different strong options. In 4th place on win rate, we have the Aeldari. They seem to have wins of 53%, apparently up very slightly on previously from a pre-update 52, and perhaps partly in wake of their recent codex with their shiny new Aspect Warrior launches. They're one of the most popular armies to take to grand tournaments, the third most of the 27 there. It does seem that they are doing rather disproportionately well at the top event wins as well. 9 tournament victories there, so the second most there. Certainly one of the armies that can consistently perform well at the absolute highest level. For the latest balance changes that they got, they had points nerfs to several strong Aspect Warrior units, Wave Serpents went up a bit, and there was a nerf to Azaman, though it did feel at the time a little bit surprising that they'd gone quite so hard on the Aspect Warriors, when it was looking like the Inari might be the single strongest thing that the Aeldari could do. And while plenty of the Aspect Warrior changes did affect them a bit, it very much looks like their Devoted of Iniad detachment looks like easily the most strongest thing that they can put on the table now, pushing a win rate of around about 60% or so, in particular with their core detachment rule allowing them a really impactful move out of sequence, which can be massive to keep things safe from enemy charges or line up a massive damage hit next turn. They've got plenty more though, including damage dealer options, a lot of fights first on the go when needed, and a few other interesting shenanigans, and a Reign with Incubi and the Incarn teleporting around the board are both really powerful choices too. The Aspect Host seems to be the second most played and also seems to have some success, but just not quite as much. Otherwise, for strong units, the majority of the Aspect Warriors are really quite powerful right now. Fire Dragons are fairly godly anti-tank, Striking Scorpions are efficient for the mid-board, even after a small points nerf. Warp Spiders jump 24 inches and do secondaries and mess up enemy light infantry. Howling Banshees can charge really far and are pretty nice in Inari, and Dark Reapers can shoot hard and can take Tempest launchers for a bit of indirect. A fair few of them might work with a Wave Serpent as well. Nice for all the options to re-embark with various different detachments. Wraith Lords are a fairly generally powerful datasheets, and outside of the Inari, the Phoenix Lords tend to be popular choices. Several of those are really interesting in their own way. That's definitely not the only stuff though, and a whole bunch of their codex is pretty interesting and powerful, and lots of units get significantly better in their own themed detachment. In terms of weaknesses, maybe having the Inari be the best way to play Aeldari isn't exactly the thing that most people would generally like to see. It'd be nice to have them on a bit more of a level playing field. For their actual gameplay though, they're not exactly the easiest army to command. Lots of mental load with the sheer amount of options on offer between stratagems, battle focus, and all the out of sequence things they can do. And some of those options just aren't going to be quite as powerful in people who aren't quite so familiar with the faction or the core movement mechanics of 40k. If going very heavy on the foot dar as well, they might not like occasionally running into armies that go heavy on indirect fire or close deep striking alpha strikers, anything that might be able to get the jump on fragile aspect warriors and hit them before they hit you. In general though, Inari do seem to be one of the single strongest armies in 40k right now, and I kind of wouldn't be too surprised if Games Workshop do pull some sort of balance nerf on them sooner or later. Next up, and placing in third, also on 53%, we've got the Chaos Demons. They've dropped a bit from the big 56% that they had prior to the balance update, though have kind of completely changed the way in which they're winning quite so hard. Previously going from Legion of Excess and now Shadow Legion and Demon Incursion. They're one of the most popular armies to take to big tournaments, 5th most popular out of 27, which is certainly higher than normal for them. Looks like quite a lot of people enjoyed the changes made in their index and their shiny new Shadow Legion detachment. They're one of the most successful armies in terms of tournament victories, joint third on that metric with Guard and Space Marines with 7 victories or 5-0 undefeated runs, so it looks like they're an army that's both doing well for the average player and on the top tables. For their balance changes, they were maybe the single most altered army in the last balance path, basically getting a sort of soft index reboot with a bunch of profiles and units rewritten and points cost changes accordingly. They got their new detachment in Shadow Legion, though at the same time got some heavy nerfs to Legion of Excess, plus unexpectedly having their Seeker Chariot datasheets removed. Now as a result, the detachments being used in competitive play are a fairly even split between Shadow Legion and Demonic Incursion, both of those doing rather well. Shadow Legion has its specific deity buffs, quite nice to have a detachment rule that favours units in ways they find helpful, nice to have extra tough Nurgle and Tzeentch and more dangerous Khorne for example. They can mix in some Chaos Space Marine units, giving them a bunch more datasheet access if they want it, and have some pretty fun stratagems and some very good enhancements on top of that, including returning to reserve and scouting. Demonic Incursion on the other hand has its close range deep strikes and jumping into melee, plus some powerful greater demon enhancements like the dreaded 4+ Feel No Pain Great Unclean one. Lots of stuff can be interesting enough at the moment. The focus still seems to be largely on the greater demons for dealing with enemy heavies, lists tending to go pretty heavy on those both for Shadow Legion and Demonic Incursion. Be'lakor's pretty great with his rewritten datasheet as well, and countering enemy gun lines as you can't shoot the chunk of the army near him unless you're within 18 inches. Quite a lot of their datasheets seem really quite good objective support after the updates as well. Flesh Hands with their return to reserve, Flamers are nice and cheap deep strikers with a bit of firepower, Nurglings are even cheaper, Beasts are seriously quite useful with Scout included in their cost now, and maybe some Plague Bearers for some OC and sticky objectives. Overall they seem like they're in a very good place currently. Perhaps one of their biggest weaknesses is some uncertainty as to how Games Workshop treats them after the Deity Legion books come out. It feels like they're in line for another round of changes then, very likely losing some fine cast characters at some point, and I certainly wouldn't be too surprised if they pull some other moves like removing things in a similar sort of style to those Seeker Chariots, though hopefully not of course. Next up, and it seems that second on the win rate metric, are the Imperial Knights. They seem to be on 54%, so a +1 up from 53, and these guys felt kind of predictable to be up here, being in a fairly strong place and then seemingly only getting better with the balance pass. They're a kind of middling played army, 11th most popular out of 27 armies at grand tournaments, and as often seems to be the case for Knights and Chaos Knights, despite some of the higher win rates don't seem to be actually winning events quite as often as some, but they have still managed to either event wins or 5-0 undefeated runs. The balance changes weren't the biggest for them. The Castellan and Valiant both dropped down to 480 points. The Collector's Assassin is a bit cheaper to ally in, but broadly they do fairly similar to what they did before. The Grotmus detachment wasn't very good, so they're still on the Noble Lance from the Index, big rerolls with the Laylo the Tyrants and some nice Feel No Pain, rotate Ion Shields and some other powerful strats, and in recent times their builds have tended to shift to a bit more Armiger spam than they had before. The Armigers do feel kind of weirdly cheap and efficient, as they were pretty usable when they were 10 points more expensive. A lot of their lists are now going either 1 or 2 big knights, as opposed to the 3-ish that they often were previously. Compared with the Chaos Knights though, it feels like a lot more of their Titanic Knights are a bit more usable and have motivation to take them. Canis Rex still seems rather standout with his big damage and free stratagems, though lots of them are solidly usable. The Atropos, Lancer, Errant, Castellan and Paladin perhaps being good examples. There's more that's playable than are overshadowed. Plenty of lists often take at least some allied agents as well, the Calidus Assassin being the most popular for jumping around the board doing secondaries. There are some other interesting agents options though, the cheaper Collectors, maybe the Ministorum Priest, or Sisters of Battle in an Immolator potentially. Overall certainly seemed like a very strong army, and probably more so in more casual or RTT style games as opposed to the top ends of grand tournaments, perhaps places where people might be a little bit harder placed to handle the big stat check that they are. Seems like they're probably set to have a pretty good time until their codex comes out. Finally, right at the top of the tree, of course, we have those greenskins. Placing in first are the Orks, with a massive tournament win rate of 57%, a big +7% from pre-update, a fairly solid jump on the next army in Warhammer 40K, though if anything their event wins tally is more impressive than that. They've got a big 21 either event victories or 5-0 undefeated runs under their belt just in the few short weeks since the last balance pass. Kind of telling that they're double the next challenger in the Aeldari, who's only down on 9. Play rates wise, they're the 4th most played army out of the 27 factions, which if anything seems almost kind of low given just how powerful they are. And they're quite a popular faction too, though I feel like perhaps at least a little bit of that might be because the way that they're strong is really quite a specific shooting list. Most people don't really have the units available to run a fully optimised Mordaka detachment. For their last balance update, they had nerfs to the Tactical Brigade, which was doing rather well before. They had pricier tank busters and the shock attack gun mech, though all of this was completely outweighed by gaining the Mordaka detachment with its fairly crazy sustained hits too for all orc shooting for infantry and walkers, often equating to pretty well double damage there. Some helpful shooting stratagems to give you extra AP or ignores cover, and then in particular one command point war stratagem, which is pretty much the most valuable stratagem in the game in its own way. Just the sheer amount of layered buffs that can give you on a unit is kind of crazy, giving you around about 5 odd special rules all at once. For the detachments being used in competitive play, the Mordaka detachment is rather utterly dominant, being played more than all the rest combined, and has win rates of around about 60% or more. Warhorde being the next most popular for some melee greenskins. For the Mordaka army, the core of it generally tends to be 3 sets of looters, 3 tank busters, and 3 shock attack guns, all being units that just go to absolutely god tier with sustained hits too. Then usually Zodgrod Wartsnagger with 20 Gretchen to zoom into the midboard and basically be an enormous move block tar pit turn 1 if you're given the war stratagem, which if the opponents don't screen or can't screen, then it might well win a game then and there. Trucks can be used to get the units there, and might have a bit of a mix between these and some melee units with bosses, plenty of different effective orc melee units that can make use of the war stratagem and are good elsewhere. Flash skits are pretty nice for a good general purpose unit too. Then usually being backed up by some Gretchen and some Storm Boys to score some objectives and farm some command points. Most of the other detachments really quite heavily push the Orks in various different ways, and the current Daka list certainly feel like a big departure compared with the rest of the things that work for the other detachments. For weaknesses for Mordaka at the moment, perhaps being the army to beat means a lot of people are really focusing on them and thinking about how they can try and win against it. Maybe armies like Aeldari having some of the most hope, given that they generally tend to play with low durability units anywhere and a huge focus on hiding, so having just ridiculously excessive damage output doesn't always necessarily mean that you're killing any more than you would anyway. But the vast majority of armies that are actually seeking to go head to head in a sort of damage contest with Mordaka are probably going to lose if the Mordaka player is quite good. Looks like it's certainly set to remain the army to beat though, with the Orks being clearly the strongest army at the moment from the stats. I'd say perhaps the biggest weakness for them is just whatever happens to them in the next balance pass, because I just can't see Mordaka surviving in its current form after Games Workshop take a second look at it. I guess it might wait until the next balance update, though I certainly wouldn't be surprised if Games Workshop do a second pass sort of emergency balance patch, which could happen very shortly indeed. Finally, just to round up, here's a few lists of the top 15 for a bunch of different armies. For the win percentages, we've got Orks at the top, then Knights, Demons, Aeldari, Necrons and Genestealer Cults at the moment. For top tournament wins or 5-0 undefeated runs, Orks are just massively ahead, but good numbers for the Aeldari, Space Marines, Chaos Demons, Guard and Necrons. These will be a bit warped by the number of people playing the factions, but even accounting for that, it still looks like those armies do stand pretty high up in the rankings. And then for play rates at grand tournaments, it's Custodes first, then Space Marines, Aeldari, Orks and Chaos Demons making up the top 5. Custodes players certainly seem to be enjoying their Lion's Blade, maybe a few less Space Marine players being motivated after the last wave of nerfs Games Workshop hit them with perhaps. Chaos Demons certainly seem higher up there than I'd expect as well, and Tau all the way down at 15 is certainly unusually low for them. In any case, looking forward to hearing your thoughts. What are your takes on the strongest 40k armies at the moment? Finally, just to round out the video, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Titan's Terrain as mentioned, and talk through some options with their folding cardboard terrain system. As mentioned, I rate their biggest advantages of this being the pop-up design, which means that you can store it completely flat, transport it easily in a small box. That's something that it can perhaps do better than virtually any 40k terrain set out there. It is far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, though you can say that of a lot of things, and it's at least somewhat comparable to MDF boards that you might go out and find. And for people whose time is a bit stretched for hobbying, it can be an advantage that it doesn't need painting or assembly and is just ready to go straight out of the box. The folding design does come with some trade-offs though. Cardboard's a bit less hard-wearing than some of the other terrain sets that you might find out there, and might need a little bit more care taken with it than some. The grid layout can mean that there's a bit less flexibility and can create some firing lanes in 40k. Might not be the worst idea to break them up a bit with a couple of extra pieces on top. The buildings can have some issues with putting models in the tops of them. It doesn't really make tournament approved layouts, so aiming at a bit more of a casual gaming crowd than a hyper competitive one. In any case, they've got a few different designs for their sets. A Forgotten Furnace one that's basically a Chaos Foundry, all furnaces and glowing runes and things. A more standard bombed out city board set, lots of ruined buildings and armoured containers and things. And then a more verdant set of ruins that might be appropriate for fantasy gameplay, as well as the grim darkness of the far future. Each of those sets also has an expansion centerpiece one, basically made by pushing two different tiles right next to each other to make one enormous building. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, linked down in the video description below. That's just about it for this one though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to check out the 40k discount links in the video description or the channel's Patreon page. A massive thank you to anyone supporting there, of course. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, names in credits and things like that. In any case though, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.